It feels like everywhere you turn these days, people are talking about gender, what it means, how we understand it. It's a big topic,
It really is. Lots of questions, lots of different viewpoints floating around.
definitely. And that's why today we wanted to really dig into one specific perspective. We're looking at a document from the Vatican's Education Office.
That's right. It's called Male and Female, He Created Them, published back in 2019 by the Congregation for Catholic Education.
Okay, so Catholic Education Office, aimed mostly at educators, parents, people in Catholic schools.
Primarily, yes,
Yeah.
that's the main audience. But honestly, the themes it tackles, gender, identity, education, they're relevant far beyond that context for anyone working with young people or just thinking about these issues.
Makes sense. So what's our mission with this deep dive then?
Our goal is really to unpack what this document is saying. What are its key arguments about gender theory? What problems does it see? What kind of education does it propose?
So we're presenting its viewpoint, giving listeners a clear look at this specific lens on the whole conversation.
Exactly. Understanding the perspective.
So diving in,
Mhm.
the document apparently starts pretty strongly. It talks about an educational crisis.
It does, yeah. Right at the beginning, an educational crisis, specifically concerning affectivity and sexuality. That's their framing.
A crisis.
Yeah.
That's significant wording. What's driving that concern?
Well, the document suggests that some educational approaches out there are based on an anthropology of view of the human person that they feel clashes with, well, both faith and what they call right reason.
Okay, so a fundamental disagreement about what it means to be human.
Sort of, yeah. And the worry is that this different anthropology could destabilize the family structure as they understand it.
And part of this crisis, or disorientation as they put it, involves how we see men and women.
They argue there's a tendency to, like, cancel out the differences between men and women or to see these differences as purely, social constructs, not inherent.
Just society's invention, basically.
That's the view they're concerned about, yes.
Okay, so that leads into how they discuss gender theory. How does this document actually define that term? It gets used in so many ways.
It does. And here it's important to see how they define it. The document presents gender theory as an ideology.
An ideology, okay.
And they define the ideology as something that, quote, denies the difference and reciprocity in nature of a man and a woman. And it sort of imagines a society where those sexual differences don't really matter anymore.
So the document's take is that gender theory aims to erase male-female distinctions.
That's the interpretation they put forward, yeah. And flowing from that, they worry it leads to educational programs that kind of disconnect personal identity and even emotional intimacy from your biological sex.
Right, this idea that your identity isn't necessarily tied to your body at birth.
Exactly. The document highlights this idea that within this framework, as they see it, identity becomes purely a matter of individual choice, something fluid, potentially changing.
That seems to be a major point of concern for them.
A central one, definitely.
Yeah.
This perceived separation of identity from biology.
Now, what I find interesting is that despite these pretty strong critiques, the document also calls for dialogue. It doesn't just shut the door.
No, it doesn't. And that's a really crucial point they make. They explicitly advocate for a path of dialogue on gender in education.
Okay.
But, and this is key, they draw a sharp line between what they call the ideology of gender and the wider field of actual research on gender in, sociology, psychology, the human sciences.
So it's not a rejection of all academic work on gender.
Not at all. They state an openness to listening, to reasoning, and to proposing their views in relation to research that tries to understand, how sexual difference is actually lived out in different cultures and contexts.
That's an important nuance.
It really is. It shows they're willing to engage with the academic discussion, even while they strongly critique what they perceive as a specific ideology.
And reading between the lines, it sounds like there might even be some points where they find common ground.
You're right, there are. The document explicitly acknowledges a shared goal in combating unjust discrimination. That's clearly stated.
Okay.
They even mention historical failings, within the church itself on this front, and how the idea of equal dignity for men and women, taught by Jesus, took time to really sink into the culture.
That's quite self-aware, acknowledging past issues.
It is. And building on that, they agree on the need to educate children to respect every single person, their particularity, their difference, preventing bullying based on any characteristic, including sexual tendencies.
So respect for the individual, fighting discrimination, Those are shared values.
Definitely. And it goes further. The document speaks quite positively about what it terms the values of femininity.
Values of femininity, like what?
Things like women's capacity for the other, their ability to understand situations in a perhaps more realistic or grounded way. It also mentions women's resilience, their ability to endure adversity.
Interesting. So acknowledging distinct contributions.
Yes, and their significant role in education, both in the family and society. So there are these points of agreement, these shared concerns.
But then inevitably it returns to the critique of gender theory. What are the main sticking points?
Well, the core criticism revolves around this idea of denaturalization. That's a key term for them.
Denaturalization, moving away from nature.
Exactly. The concern is that gender theory, especially what they see as more radical versions, moves away from nature, from biological reality, towards something based purely on subjective feelings or individual will.
So the feeling becomes more important than the physical reality.
That's the worry. And they argue this leads to a kind of liquidity or fluidity, not just in sexual identity, but even in the concept of family itself.
Fluidity based on.
Based on what they see as confused ideas about freedom and sort of momentary desires rather than objective truth or inherent nature.
And they trace us back to a philosophical viewpoint.
They identify what they call a dualistic anthropology, basically, separating the mind or will from the body, treating the body as secondary or something to be manipulated by the will.
And that leads to
Relativism, in their view, where everything becomes subjective, all choices are equally valid, there's no inherent order or meaning derived from nature.
So the fear is that gender, this internal sense, overrides biological sex in importance.
Precisely. And that this shift drives a whole cultural and even legal revolution based on this relativistic idea that there are no objective truths grounding identity.
What about the idea that all identities should have equal value? Does the document engage that?
It does, but critically. The
Okay.
concern raised is that if all identities are seen as equally valid and interchangeable in a way, it might actually negate the specific relevance or meaning of each one.
How so?
Specifically, they worry it diminishes the significance of the natural complementarity they see between male and female, which they view as foundational for the family. It could, in their view, empty the concept of family of its core meaning.
So a tension between equality and the meaning derived from difference.
That's a good way to put it. And the practical outcome they fear is educational programs that essentially ignore or radically break with biological differences.
Promoting a kind of freedom without limits.
Where freedom is seen as purely arbitrary, acting without reference to any external truths or values rooted in human nature.
Okay, so that's the critique. What's the alternative perspective they offer, the Christian anthropological perspective?
Right. This view is explicitly rooted in the Genesis creation account. Male and female, he created them.
Okay.
The core idea here is that human nature isn't just raw material for us to shape however we want. It's something given, something to be respected. This forms the basis of what Pope Francis calls human ecology.
Human ecology, like respecting our own nature.
Exactly, respecting the inherent structure of our being. And central to that structure, in this view, is the idea that the self is completed by the other, specifically the male by the female and vice versa.
This reciprocity again.
Yes, a dynamic reciprocity they believe is sustained by God, the Creator. It's not just a social arrangement. It's seen as part of the fundamental reality of being human.
And how does the body fit into this? Is it just biology?
No, they emphasize the unity of body and soul. It's not physicalism reducing everything to biology, nor is it, ignoring the body. It's an integrated view. Our physical nature matters deeply to who we are.
So identity isn't just biology, but biology is fundamental.
That seems to be the balance they strike. Personal identity matures through relationships, through openness to others, influenced by many factors, but that maturation happens within the reality of being created male or female.
And reaffirming this male-female duality is crucial for them.
Yes, they see it as essential, particularly for the family. It's presented as a necessary refutation of attempts to, erase this fundamental difference.
So how should education about sexuality approach this?
From this perspective, it involves learning the meaning of your own body in its masculinity or femininity, appreciating your own body, your own sex, as a way to then recognize, respect, and enrich yourself through encounters with a different sex.
Okay. Now, the document puts a huge emphasis on the family's role in all this, doesn't it?
Absolutely massive. The family is described as the primary, the natural place where this reciprocity between men and women is lived out and learned.
More than just a social unit, then.
Much more. It's seen as having deep anthropological, social, and cultural significance, something that shouldn't be redefined by, fleeting ideologies.
And specific rights come from that.
Yes, they highlight two fundamental rights stemming from the family's nature. First, the family's right to be the primary educators of their children.
Ahead of the school or state.
Yes. And second, the right of children to grow up, ideally, with both a father and a mother figure.
And parents have a serious duty here.
A most grave duty, the document says, to provide a well-rounded education. And that includes sexual and affective education, but framed within a bigger picture of love, chastity, and self-giving.
So kids learn about difference and complementarity first at home.
That's the ideal presented, yes. Learning the value and beauty of sexual difference within the family context.
So if the family is primary, what's the role left for schools and society?
Schools play a subsidiary role. Complementary, they support the family.
Right?
Catholic schools, specifically, are envisioned as being for the human person, centered on Christ's teachings. But the idea is partnership, respecting the family's role.
An educating community.
Yes, fostering dialogue, tolerance, respect for different views, while still being grounded in its own ethos and respecting the family's culture and rights.
And the teachers, the formators, are important too.
Hugely. The document stresses forming educators who are mature, balanced, well-prepared, always learning, people who can handle these sensitive topics well.
And handle the language carefully.
Yes, using appropriate, measured language. Helping young people develop a critical sense, to evaluate all the messages they're getting from the wider culture.
And that wider culture is also a concern.
Mm-hmm. The document links what it sees as a decline in marriage culture to other social problems, especially those affecting vulnerable people.
So it calls for a kind of alliance.
Exactly. A reconstructed educational alliance between family, school, and society based on subsidiarity, each doing its part, and mutual respect.
So we come back around to dialogue as the preferred method.
Yes. Listening, reasoning, proposing. That's presented as the most constructive path forward. Better than, ideological standoffs that just isolate people.
And the Christian proposal aims for
helping men and women realize their full potential as integrated beings, incarnate spirits, body, and soul together.
And Catholic educators have a specific role in this dialogue.
They're called to be faithful to their gospel identity, yes, but to see challenges as opportunities, to witness through dialogue.
Teaching about love.
And preparing young people for what the document calls the integral and generous gift of self, particularly expressed in marriage, while also affirming the right of Catholic schools to teach their perspective and for families to choose that.
And practically, these programs need care.
Definitely. Age-appropriate, respectful, discreet, confidential, creating trust, especially for young people facing difficult situations.
Okay, so pulling this all together.
Yeah.
What's the main takeaway from this deep dive into the document?
I think the central argument is really the crucial role of a specific Christian understanding of the human person, rooted in that male-female complementarity as the foundation for education in affectivity and sexuality.
But not a vacuum.
Right. Crucially, it stresses that this foundation needs to be lived out and explained through dialogue, engaging with contemporary questions, not just asserted defensively.
Yeah.
So it's that combination of firm anthropological grounding and a commitment to dialogue.
That definitely gives us a lot to chew on. It lays out a very distinct framework, and maybe a final thought for our listeners to consider building on this. Well, thinking about the document's perspective, how might educational environments actually balance that commitment to a specific view of human nature and relationships with the need to genuinely respect the diverse individual experiences and identities that students bring?
That's the tightrope, isn't it? How to hold both. A really important question.
It really is. We absolutely encourage you, if you're interested, to read the full document, Male and Female, He Created Them, for yourself, and of course, to keep exploring the many, many viewpoints on these complex and important subjects.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.